Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this episode, I want to cover interoperability. And when I mean interoperability, I'm talking about building two different applications using different messaging frameworks that communicate using a shared broker. In this case, I'm going to be using RabbitMQ, and the two frameworks I'm going to be using are MassTransit and NServiceBus. Why NServiceBus? Because I get this question pretty regularly, particularly from people that have an existing NSB solution and that they want to then add new message consumers or use new sagas or capabilities of MassTransit and make that work with their existing infrastructure that they already have in an existing application. So I thought this would be a good sample to put together because honestly, I needed to make sure it worked for myself, and MassTransit has had interoperability components with NServiceBus for a while, but they haven't really been talked about very well. So I thought I would cover that tonight. The other thing I thought that brought this to mind was there was an article posted, I guess a couple months ago, on how to consume MassTransit messages with NServiceBus. And I thought it was interesting because you can see kind of how the MassTransit, envelope-based message code works in here, and how this maps to like all the different headers that, that NServiceBus puts into an envelope, and what the payload looks like. And, I found it interesting, the way they had to build this whole ingest behavior and a bunch of behaviors in the pipeline. I didn't go into that too much. I took what was an existing NSB application that I had just created, and then I added and replaced one of the services using MassTransit. So let's kind of jump into the code and see what this looks like. So in my solution, I have a legacy app API, and that API is just a web API that uses two different assemblies, one called legacy app.components, and then the other legacy app.contracts. Now the message contracts are in here, and it's our standard order type solution. So I have submit order with iMessage. iMessage is required by NServiceBus to identify a message, and I have order number and amount. Pretty simple. I also have an event that gets produced, order submitted, with just that order number and amount. And I don't even use the order amount. I also have an order submission accepted. If you look at a lot of my samples where I have an API controller sending a message, I typically then expect something back. In this case, I just have an iMessage. It's an order submission accepted, and that's the response that comes back. Now with just NServiceBus doing this, we have a number of different handlers. We have the submit order handler, which handles that command, and it pulls a message header out of it for a request key. Don't know why I would do that, but I do. I then reply using the reply options to pass that same header back. And I also publish the order submitted event. And I use it using that iMessage handler context that's added on the handle method. I wait for both those tasks to finish and everything is great. The order submitted handler is just going to consume that order submitted event and then write out that it received the order submitted and maybe charging a credit card. The order submission accepted handler is that response that gets sent back that I want to make sure contains that header key because I wanted something to kind of verify that that was there. So if I run, this is already running in the background. The configuration for this in the program CS is I'm creating an endpoint called order endpoint. And inside the host builder, I'm using NServiceBus. I'm setting up the endpoint configuration with that name. I'm using the serialization of Newtonsoft JSON. I want to enable installers, and I'm setting it to use RabbitMQ. I'm setting a connection string, telling it to use classic queues at this point with conventional routing topology, which sets up some things on RabbitMQ. I then get the routing, and I say I want to route to an endpoint. I want the submit order to be routed to the new order endpoint. Now, originally I had this as just order endpoint, which would send it back to that handler because it's an iMessage, it's sent, so it needs to be routed by the routing rules. Beyond that, that's all that's in there. There's an API controller, and in my controller, I have the ability to post an order. And I take a dependency on an iMessage session, which is the NServiceBus tool to actually send a message. So I create some send options. I set the header of the request key. I call session.send with that new submit order message and return accepted. So very simple controller. in here, based on this routing, it should route it to that new order endpoint. Again, I had it pointed at the old one before, but now I want it to go to the new one that's written in MassTransit. So that's all of the NServiceBus code that's in place. Now, I wanted to create the new worker that was using MassTransit, and I did that by just creating a .NET new worker. I come into the host builder, I say host builder, create default builder, use MassTransit. That's the host builder extension method. It's actually on top of the iHost builder. It does the same thing as add MassTransit. It just makes it fit nicely into that schema. In this case, I created a submit order consumer, and I'm telling specifically that I want it to run on this new order endpoint because I want it to have that name for when NServiceBus is going to route that message to that new order endpoint. And I also wanted to add an order submitted consumer to consume that same event that gets published by the handler or the consumer, either way. I'm then telling it to use RabbitMQ. I put these in here, although it seems like these things end up on the broker anyway from NServiceBus. I'm not exactly sure why. But this is just to say don't create exchanges for these types in the broker. I don't think it really matters because they were there when I just ran the NServiceBus version, so apparently it creates everything out. I don't know for sure if that's the case, but that's what I saw. And here I'm telling the bus to use the NServiceBus JSON serializer. And what this means is that any messages produced will be sent using a JSON serializer that is compatible with the NServiceBus message format. So all of those messages will come in. In addition, it adds support to be able to deserialize messages coming from NServiceBus. I then call configure endpoints, which is going to create queues for each of these two consumers and bind up the appropriate exchanges. And in this case, I'm just telling it if I want to configure the transport options for RabbitMQ and change things. Right now, I'm just using localhost, but if I was a container, I might give the actual broker name. So both of these are running right now. And if I go out here to Swagger, I can see that I have an order, and let's call this order 21, and let's say that it's $121. And I'm going to hit execute. I can see that I immediately got that 202 back. And if I go and look at the run window, I can take a look and see what happened in here. So this is our legacy API app. We can see that the controller was invoked, and it says sending submit order, request key is this, order number is order 21. We can also see that the order submitter handler was invoked. This is that handler that subscribes to the order submitted event. That was invoked. And the order submission accepted, which gets sent back to the response address, which then goes to that endpoint for that service in the API, was also called. If I look at my new app worker, I can see that my new app worker received the submit order, order 21. It said it's responding with order submission accepted and publishing the order submitted response, setting the values key. And then we can see that I also have a consumer in my new MassTransit system that is consuming that same order submitted event. And it's just that same event that's produced. It was actually received by both the handler in NServiceBus and the handler in MassTransit. So it just works. I mean, you're able to interoperate. I'm using JSON in this format. There's also an XML serializer version. The MassTransit submit order consumer is pretty simple. It pulls that header off just to log it, but it doesn't really need it for anything else. It calls task when all context.publish order submitted and context.respond async order submission accepted. So it knows the appropriate NServiceBus headers are there as far as the source, the reply to address and all of that. So many of the things that are discussed in this article, if you're going to use MassTransit to add new capabilities on top of an existing system that needs to interoperate with an existing NServiceBus system, you can just use these interop serializers and, to coin a phrase, Bob's your uncle. The assembly that has the interop components is the masstransit.interop.nservicebus NuGet package. It has the 2 additional serializers. They're both built with Newtonsoft, which is the same serialization format that's used by NServiceBus for JSON. I mean, it just sort of works. So it gives you some flexibility if you want to use certain mass transit capabilities, such as like the state machine sagas, or some of the routing slip capabilities, or just any of the other things that might be more suitable. Or if you have a team that works with one and wants to work with the other, the options are really any way you want to make it work. Yeah, I mean, interoperability used to be hard. I mean, integrations between applications were very bespoke, and we would have to deal with custom wire formats, custom calling formats, dealing with specific issues. By having RabbitMQ in the middle, you're able to take that additive philosophy of building and adding to applications over time without necessarily having to use the same frameworks. Frameworks evolve and they change, and the ones that we want to use might not be the same ones we used 3 or 4 years ago. So it gives us a lot of opportunity. I've been building interoperable applications for most of my life. Almost all my experiences with distributed systems. So it's nice to be able to apply these tools and solve these solutions this way using, in my preference, MassTransit, but also working with existing applications. Say, hey, we could build this as a separate solution and just add it on. So, I think one other thing to kind of point out is I did use the same assembly for the submit order messages. I just referenced that, which of course means that I end up with a reference to NServiceBus in the new solution, I think, because it comes in through the project reference. If that was something that I didn't want to do, I could just copy and paste those message contracts into my project with that same namespace. And as long as the namespace and type match, it would work exactly well. Some people get weird and think, oh, I get a warning when I paste that in that the namespace is wrong for the folder. Well, deal with it. It's not a big deal. But the namespace and message type does have to match. And if it does, it'll work. And then you don't even need that dependency on NServiceBus. Of course, you would need to fake out the iMessage because it's going through JSON. There's no binary binding between it. So you would need to fake out these interfaces and just create them in the appropriate namespace. But beyond that, you could get by without even having a reference to that NServiceBus package, which MassTransit has no dependency on it for its interop component. So yeah, so this is, I think, a really cool solution. Definitely check it out. The link to the sample is below up on GitHub. If we look at the RabbitMQ configuration, we can look at the 2 queues. We can see that I have the new order endpoint, which has the bindings to the submit order contract, which is how MassTransit is going to get a copy of that. We also have the order submitted consumer that we built that subscribes to that order submitted event, which if we look at that and we look at the contract of this, we can see that this is bound to a whole bunch of different types: order submitted and also order endpoint, which is that endpoint that had that handler within the existing legacy API project. So everything's kind of routed by RabbitMQ, makes it pretty simple. Yeah. So yeah, interoperability. Yes, it's hard and it's complex, although I'd like to think of it as sophisticated because that's a nicer way of saying complex. But it doesn't have to be impossible, and it's pretty great that we can do this kind of stuff these days without having to rewrite and rebuild entire systems all at once. So that's what I have for tonight. Hopefully this is useful. Definitely, if you have any questions, hit back in the comments. If you do enjoy the content on the channel, I'll be like every other YouTube producer and say be sure to subscribe, because that's the best way to find out about new episodes, especially with certain social media systems where they're usually advertised in mayhem right now. I'll also point out that if you have questions about this, or have an existing solution and need some advice or support, there is the support site on MassTransit where support services are now available. So this is something that I'm offering for MassTransit users that need help and want architectural guidance, technical guidance, code reviews, whatever, just to help people understand and build distributed systems the way can be done with, thinking about those forward type things. So definitely check that out if you're in need of help. Other than that, signing off. We'll catch you on the next episode.